June 6, 1944. As Nazi planes swooped down to slaughter American soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, they suddenly slammed into invisible steel wires suspended from what Hitler called England's ridiculous floating air mines. How did Britain's mocked balloon idea become the unexpected shield that saved thousands of Allied lives on D-Day when traditional military defenses had failed? The sky over Normandy was filled with the roar of engines as Nazi planes swooped down toward the beaches. American soldiers huddled in their landing craft, knowing they'd be easy targets once they hit the shore. The Germans had ruled these skies for years, and their pilots were eager to rain death on the invading Allied forces. But something strange happened that morning. As the German planes dove toward the beaches, many suddenly jerked sideways or pulled up sharply. Some even exploded mid-air. The reason? All across the sky floated hundreds of giant balloons, each one tethered to the ground or to ships by strong steel cables. These simple balloons created an invisible wall that turned the air itself into a deadly trap for enemy aircraft. 4 years earlier, this scene would have seemed impossible. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. Each night, hundreds of German bombers crossed the English Channel to drop their deadly loads on London and other cities. Over 43,000 British civilians would die in these raids. The Royal Air Force fought bravely, but they were outnumbered. They lost 1,700 planes trying to defend their homeland. The big anti-aircraft guns weren't much help either. They fired thousands of shells but hit almost nothing. For every 2,500 shells fired, they might down just one German plane. Something had to change, or Britain would be crushed. That's when an unlikely hero stepped forward with an idea so simple that many thought it was stupid. Wing Commander Percival Dove wasn't like most military men. Tall and thin with round glasses, he looked more like a teacher than a warrior. Before the war, he had studied weather patterns and how things move through air. While other officers talked about bigger guns and faster planes, Dove quietly worked on a different kind of defense. "The problem isn't that we can't hit their planes," Dove explained to anyone who would listen. "The problem is that they can fly wherever they want." His superiors shook their heads. They wanted solutions that went boom and killed Germans, not weird science experiments. Air Marshal Henry Carleton didn't hide his feelings during one meeting at the Air Ministry in London. "We need more guns and planes, not floating gas bags," he shouted, his face red with anger. "This is a war, not a children's birthday party." The room filled with laughter, and Dove's cheeks burned with shame. But he didn't give up. That night, as air raid sirens wailed and bombs fell on London, he watched from a rooftop as British fighters scrambled to intercept the raiders. The fighters were brave, but often couldn't find the enemy in the dark. The searchlights tried to help by lighting up the sky, but the German pilots simply flew around them. The big anti-aircraft guns made lots of noise and flash, but their shells almost always missed. Dove noticed something important. When German planes spotted searchlights or gun flashes, they changed course. They flew higher or turned away. "We don't need to shoot down every plane," he whispered to himself as another bomb exploded in the distance. "We just need to control where they fly." The next morning, with London still smoking from the night's attack, Dove pulled out a sheet of paper and began to sketch. His idea was surprisingly simple. Fill the sky with obstacles that would force enemy planes to fly higher, where they would be less accurate with their bombs and more visible to defending fighters. These obstacles would be big balloons, some as tall as a 6-story building, filled with hydrogen gas to make them float. Each balloon would be tied to the ground with a steel cable. A plane hitting one of these cables at high speed would be torn apart like paper. Even if pilots could see the balloons, they'd have to fly around or over them, pushing them right into the sights of British fighters and guns. When Dove showed his plan to his commanding officer, Group Captain William Marsh, he expected more laughter. Instead, Marsh rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The brass wants fancy new weapons," Marsh said quietly, "but we don't have time for fancy. We need something now." He looked at Dove's drawings again. This is so simple it might actually work. But most other officers weren't convinced. At a big meeting at the Air Ministry in London, Dove stood nervously at the front of the room as 20 senior officers stared at him. Many had fought in the last war and thought they knew everything about fighting. "You want us to fight the world's most advanced air force with balloons?" one colonel asked with a smirk. "Why not just throw rocks at them? Or perhaps we should wave white flags," another added, and the room erupted in laughter. Air Vice Marshal Thomas Piper raised his hand for silence. "Wing Commander, your idea is interesting but untested. We can't risk our limited resources on experiments when proven methods exist." Dove took a deep breath. This was his last chance. "Sir, with all due respect, our proven methods are failing. Every night hundreds of bombers get through. Our fighters can't find them in the dark. Our guns can't hit them. But these balloons don't need to see or aim. They just need to be there." He pointed to his charts. "If we force German bombers to fly above 15,000 feet, their bombing accuracy drops by half. They'll use more fuel getting to that height. They'll be more visible to our radar and fighters. And any plane that tries to fly lower risks hitting a cable and being destroyed." The room fell silent. Some officers still looked doubtful, but others were starting to nod. "It sounds crazy," Dove admitted, "but sometimes the best ideas do." As the meeting ended without a clear decision, Air Vice Marshal Piper pulled Dove aside. "I still think you're half mad," Piper said with a slight smile, "but half mad might be exactly what we need right now." Little did anyone know that this crazy balloon idea would eventually save thousands of American lives on the beaches of Normandy. And the people who laughed the loudest would soon change their tune. With no official support but a quiet nod from Air Vice Marshal Piper, Dove set to work on his balloon defense. He called his creation barrage balloons, a wall of floating sentinels that would guard the skies. Each balloon would be huge, over 60 feet tall, bigger than a city bus standing on end. They would be filled with hydrogen gas, which was lighter than air and would make the balloons float high above the ground. The balloons themselves weren't the real weapon. The danger lay in the steel cables that would tie each balloon to the ground. These cables, as thick as a man's thumb, would create an invisible fence in the sky. Any plane that tried to fly through would hit these cables and be cut to pieces. But turning this idea into reality wasn't easy. Britain was fighting for its life, and materials were scarce. The military wouldn't give Dove anything he needed, so he had to get creative. He visited weather stations to collect old weather balloons. He went to fishing docks to get strong cables. He even took cloth from parachute factories to make the balloon coverings. "We need to make these balloons tough," Dove explained to the small team of helpers he had gathered. "They need to stay up for days, even in bad weather." In a small warehouse near Portsmouth, Dove and his team worked day and night. Their first test balloon was patched together from 3 weather balloons and covered in rubber-coated cloth. It looked like a giant silver teardrop. The cable was made from strands of fishing wire twisted together. "It's not pretty," Dove admitted as they looked at their creation, "but it doesn't need to be pretty. It just needs to float." One foggy morning in October 1940, without permission from his superiors, Dove and his team took their balloon to a field near Portsmouth Dockyard. They filled it with hydrogen from tanks borrowed from a nearby weather station. As the balloon filled, it tugged at the cable, eager to rise into the sky. "Let her go," Dove called out. His team released the balloon, keeping hold of the cable. Up and up it went, until it was just a small silver dot against the grey clouds, the cable stretching tight as a bowstring. "Now we wait," Dove said, checking his watch. He had calculated that a German reconnaissance plane often flew this route to take pictures of the ships in Portsmouth Harbour. Sure enough, at just past noon, they heard the drone of an engine. A Heinkel reconnaissance plane appeared from the clouds, flying low to stay under British radar. The pilot didn't see the thin cable in his path until it was too late. There was a horrible screeching sound as the cable caught on the plane's wing. The German pilot fought for control as his plane spun sideways. The wing didn't tear off completely, but it was badly damaged. The plane limped away, trailing smoke. What Dove didn't know was that someone very important had witnessed this small victory. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park had been visiting Portsmouth that day and saw the whole thing from the ground. Park was responsible for defending southern England, and he knew a useful weapon when he saw one. That afternoon, Dove was nervously explaining to military police why he had a balloon floating without permission when Park walked in. "I want 50 of those balloons protecting London within 2 weeks, Park said without preamble. "How many men do you need?" Dove could hardly believe his luck. "At least 30 men, sir, and access to materials." Park nodded. "You'll have it, and I'll smooth things over about this unauthorized test." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes it's easier to ask forgiveness than permission, isn't it, Wing Commander?" With Park's support, Dove's barrage balloon program finally got off the ground. They set up a workshop in an old bus garage in London. Workers from clothing factories were brought in to sew the balloon coverings. Metal workers made the winches that would control the cables. Chemists helped find the best way to produce hydrogen gas in large amounts. The first 50 balloons were ready by early November 1940. They weren't perfect. The coverings leaked a little and the winches sometimes stuck, but they worked. The balloons were placed in a ring around London's most important areas: government buildings, power stations, and factories. On November 15th, the balloons faced their first real test. German bombers came in waves, more than 300 planes heading for London. Dove watched anxiously from a rooftop as the silver balloons floated above the city like giant guardians. The German pilots spotted the balloons and were forced to fly higher to avoid the cables. This made their bombs fall less accurately. Many landed in parks or empty streets instead of on buildings. Some bombers tried to fly lower between the balloons, but 2 hit cables. One crashed immediately, the other made it back to France, but with a badly damaged wing. The next morning, Dove received a call from Park. "Your balloons forced them up into the path of our fighters," Park said. "We shot down 20 more planes than usual, and bomb damage was down by nearly half." News of the success spread quickly. Churchill himself visited the balloon workshop the following week. "Most ingenious," the Prime Minister said, puffing on his cigar as he examined a balloon being prepared. "The Germans build their complicated weapons, and we defeat them with what looks like a child's toy." After that visit, the balloon program expanded rapidly. New factories were set up across Britain to make more balloons. By December 1940, there were 250 balloons protecting London. By March 1941, there were 450. The statistics told the story of their success. Before the balloons, 1 in every 5 German bombs hit an important target. After the balloons, that number dropped to 1 in 12. German planes had to fly higher, making them easier for British fighters to spot and shoot down. What had once been laughed at as a crazy balloon idea was now a key part of Britain's defence. Even the officers who had mocked Dove now wanted balloons protecting their bases and cities. But the biggest test was still to come. As Britain and America began planning the invasion of Europe, American officers looked at the balloon program with skepticism. General James Morris of the US Army Air Forces called them the most ridiculous defense I've ever seen during a planning meeting in 1943. "These might work for defending fixed positions," Morris argued, "but they're useless for a moving invasion force." Dove, now promoted to group captain for his success, disagreed. "Actually, General, we've already developed balloons that can be mounted on ships. They've been protecting our convoys for over a year now." Morris remained doubtful, but other American officers were becoming interested. The upcoming invasion of France would put thousands of American soldiers on open beaches, perfect targets for German planes. If balloons could protect them during those vulnerable moments, maybe they weren't so ridiculous after all. Little did the Americans know that these floating gas bags would soon save more American lives than any other single defensive weapon on D-Day. As 1941 turned into 1942 and then 1943, The barrage balloons became a familiar sight over Britain's skies. They had proven their worth against the German bombing raids, but an even greater challenge loomed on the horizon. The Allies were planning the largest seaborne invasion in history, the liberation of Nazi-occupied Europe starting with the beaches of France. Thousands of young American and British soldiers would soon be landing on open beaches with no cover, completely exposed to German air attacks. If the barrage balloons failed in their biggest test yet, the casualties would be catastrophic. The fate of the entire invasion might hang in the balance. By early 1944, as D-Day planning entered its final stages, Britain's balloon command had grown from Dove's small team into a massive operation. By early 1944, Britain's balloon command had grown from Dove's small team into a massive operation. More than 3,000 barrage balloons now floated above British cities, ports, and military bases. The once mocked flying gas bags had changed the way the air war was fought over England. Before the balloons, German planes could fly as low as 200 feet to drop their bombs, making them deadly accurate. Now they had to stay above 15,000 feet, or risk hitting the steel cables. At that height, less than 25% of their bombs hit anywhere near their targets. Across Britain, 52 factories worked around the clock making balloons. Each day, they produced 20 new balloons to replace damaged ones and expand the defense network. A force of 10,000 men and women now made up Balloon Command, from the factory workers who stitched the tough fabric coverings to the crews who operated the winches that raised and lowered the balloons each day. While barrage balloons proved their worth, the Allied military had also tried other ideas. They built more anti-aircraft guns, but these big weapons cost 20 times more than balloons and protected much smaller areas. They tried smoke screens to hide important targets, but the smoke often blew away in the wind and made it hard for defenders to see too. They even tested giant nets held up by poles, but these were too heavy and kept falling down in bad weather. The Germans, meanwhile, worked hard to defeat the balloon threat. They attached cable-cutting devices to their planes' wings, like giant scissors to snip through the steel cables. But these devices often failed or even damaged the planes they were meant to protect. Some German pilots received special training on how to fly between the balloons, but this took many hours that could have been spent learning other skills. And for every trick the Germans developed, the British created new counter-tricks, like adding small mines to the cables that would explode if a plane hit them. As the Allies prepared for the D-Day invasion, the biggest test for the barrage balloons was about to begin. Despite proof of their success over Britain, many American officers still doubted that balloons could protect moving ships or troops on open beaches. They wanted to rely on fighter planes and anti-aircraft guns instead. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, had to make the final decision. At a planning meeting in London 3 months before D-Day, he listened as British and American officers argued about the balloons. "Our fighters will keep German planes away from the beaches," insisted General Morris of the American forces. "We don't need these floating obstacles in our way." Dove, now an Air Commodore, pointed to a map of the invasion beaches. "Our fighters can't be everywhere at once," he explained. "There will be times when the beaches are exposed. The balloons provide constant protection." Eisenhower studied the reports in front of him. He saw that in areas protected by both fighters and balloons, 95% fewer successful bombing runs occurred compared to areas protected by fighters alone. "We'll use the balloons," Eisenhower decided. "Outfit as many landing craft as possible." And so, on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, they brought with them 2-100 barrage balloons. Each landing craft had a small balloon floating above it. Larger balloons protected the bigger ships. From above, the invasion fleet looked like it was covered with a ceiling of silver bubbles. Lieutenant Frank Miller was one of the American soldiers landing at Omaha Beach that morning. He had thought the balloons were silly when he first saw them being loaded onto the ships. But as German planes approached the invasion fleet, he watched in amazement as they had to fly high above the balloons or risk getting tangled in the cables. "Those damn balloons actually work," he told his squad as they huddled in their landing craft. "The Krauts can't get low enough to strafe us." The statistics would later confirm what Lieutenant Miller saw. On the sections of beach protected by barrage balloons, not a single successful low-level attack occurred. The German planes were forced to bomb from high altitudes, making their attacks far less deadly. In areas where balloons could not be deployed right away, German planes swooped in low, causing heavy casualties. When Eisenhower visited the beaches a few days after the landing, he watched as barrage balloons were deployed to protect the growing Allied position. He turned to his aide and said, "These simple devices saved more American lives at Normandy than any single defensive weapon." The success was so clear that even General Morris, once the biggest American critic of the barrage balloons, had to admit he was wrong. "I thought they were ridiculous," he told reporters later. "Now I want them protecting every American position in France." By July 1944, a month after D-Day, the Allies had deployed over 3,500 balloons across their territory in France. The Germans tried desperately to counter them. They sent special fighter groups to target the balloons, shooting them down when possible. But for each balloon they destroyed, a new one took its place. The impact went beyond just physical protection. German pilots began to fear the balloon-protected areas. They called the balloons Fliegertod, flyer's death. One captured German pilot told his interrogators, "We were ordered to stay away from the balloon fields. The cables are invisible until it's too late. Many of my friends died that way." By September 1944, the value of barrage balloons was no longer in question. The Allied forces had pushed deep into France, with balloons protecting key positions, supply lines, and forward bases. The official US Army report on D-Day defenses, issued that month, stated, "Barrage balloons proved extremely effective at forcing enemy aircraft to higher altitudes, reducing the accuracy of their attacks and making them more vulnerable to our fighters and anti-aircraft fire." Wing Commander Dove, the man once laughed at for his crazy balloon idea, had been proven right in the most dramatic way possible. His simple invention had changed air defense forever and saved countless lives. As he told a reporter who interviewed him near the end of the war, "Sometimes the simplest ideas are the most powerful. We didn't try to outshoot the Germans. We just changed the rules of where they could fly." What had started as an improvised defense using weather balloons and fishing wire had grown into a massive operation that helped secure the success of the largest invasion in military history. And it had all begun because one man looked at the problem differently than everyone else. As World War II came to an end in 1945, the skies over Europe slowly emptied of barrage balloons. Workers carefully winched them down for the last time. The Silver Sentinels that had guarded cities, ports, and battlefields were no longer needed. But the story of these simple yet effective defenders was far from over. Many people expected barrage balloons to disappear completely after the war, becoming just another forgotten weapon. Instead, they evolved to serve new purposes in a changing world. The US Weather Bureau took hundreds of the balloons and modified them for weather research. These new weather balloons carried instruments high into the sky to study wind patterns, air pressure, and storms. The information they collected helped make weather forecasting much more accurate than before the war. Other balloons found new jobs as platforms for early radio and telephone signals. By 1950, modified barrage balloons floated high above remote areas, carrying radio equipment that bounced signals across mountains and valleys. They helped bring telephone service to places where running wires would have been too difficult or expensive. These floating radio stations were direct ancestors of today's communications satellites. Wing Commander Dove, the man who had fought so hard for his crazy balloon idea, returned to a quiet life after the war. The British government awarded him the Order of the British Empire, OBE, for his service. But it was a modest honor compared to the impact of his invention. Unlike many military inventors, Dove never patented his barrage balloon innovations or tried to profit from them. When asked why not, he simply said, They belong to everyone who needed protection, not to me. Dove went back to his first love, studying weather patterns, working at the British Meteorological Office until his retirement in 1962. He rarely spoke about his war work, and many of his neighbors never knew that the quiet man living down the street had saved thousands of lives with his invention. When he died in 1975, his obituary in most newspapers was just a few lines long. Yet while Dove himself faded from public memory, his invention lived on in surprising ways. In the 1950s, the US military developed a new type of defensive balloon called an aerostat. These modern cousins of barrage balloons were filled with helium instead of hydrogen, making them safer. They carried radar equipment instead of steel cables, allowing them to detect aircraft and missiles from great distances. By the 1980s, these aerostats were guarding the borders of the United States, floating 2 miles high and able to spot aircraft or boats from 200 miles away. The drug smugglers trying to sneak into the country called them fat boys and feared them greatly because, unlike human guards, these floating sentinels never slept or took breaks. Today, modern versions of Dove's idea still protect soldiers on battlefields around the world. In Afghanistan and Iraq, American and British forces use balloon-carried cameras and radars to watch for enemy fighters. These persistent threat detection systems, as the military calls them, can stay up for weeks at a time, providing constant protection. They prevented countless surprise attacks and saved many lives. Even space exploration has benefited from the humble barrage balloon. NASA uses high-altitude balloons to carry scientific instruments to the edge of space, where they can study cosmic rays and other phenomena. These giant balloons, some as large as football fields, float 20 miles above the Earth, far higher than any barrage balloon ever flew. Yet they work on the same simple principle: lighter-than-air gas lifting a payload into the sky. But perhaps the most important legacy of the barrage balloon isn't the technology itself, but the lesson it teaches about innovation and problem-solving. When Britain faced the German bombing campaign in 1940, most military experts looked for complex, high-tech solutions. They wanted better radar, faster fighters, more accurate anti-aircraft guns, all expensive and time-consuming to develop. Dove's approach was different. Instead of trying to shoot down every enemy plane, he changed the environment the planes had to fly in. He made the sky itself dangerous to low-flying aircraft. It was an elegant solution that used simple physics instead of complex machinery. This approach, changing the rules rather than playing the same game better, has inspired military thinkers ever since. General Stanley McChrystal, who led US forces in Afghanistan, often cited the barrage balloon example when talking to his staff. "Don't just try to do the same thing better," he would say. Ask yourself if there's a completely different approach that changes the whole problem. The same lesson applies beyond warfare. When engineers faced the problem of protecting tall buildings from lightning strikes, they didn't try to repel or destroy the lightning. Instead, they installed simple lightning rods that gave the electricity a safe path to the ground. When doctors struggled to fight certain diseases, they sometimes found that vaccines, which change how our bodies respond to germs, worked better than medicines that attack the germs directly. Today's world faces many complex challenges: climate change, energy needs, food production, and more. The most effective solutions may not be the most complicated or expensive ones. They might be surprisingly simple ideas that change how we think about the problem. Consider the issue of plastic pollution in oceans. Some engineers are developing complex machines to collect plastic from the water. Others are working on new types of plastic that break down more quickly. But perhaps the most effective approach so far has been the simple plastic bag tax in many countries, which has reduced plastic bag use by up to 90% in some places. Like the barrage balloon, this solution doesn't attack the problem directly. It changes the environment that creates the problem. In today's military, the spirit of the barrage balloon lives on in what strategists call asymmetric warfare, finding simple, unexpected ways to counter an enemy's strengths. When facing opponents with advanced technology, modern armies sometimes use basic tools and tactics that technology can't easily defeat. Just as the simple barrage balloon challenged the complex German bomber, today's simple innovations continue to prove that ingenious thinking can overcome seemingly superior force. As we look back at Dove's barrage balloons from our modern perspective, their genius seems obvious. Of course, steel cables suspended from balloons would force enemy planes to fly higher. Yet at the time, the idea faced mockery and resistance. Many military leaders couldn't see past their traditional thinking about air defense. This may be the most important lesson from the barrage balloon story. Sometimes the best solutions look crazy at first. They don't fit our expectations or traditional ways of thinking. They might seem too simple to work, but in that simplicity often lies their power. The next time you face a difficult problem, remember the barrage balloons. Ask yourself, am I trying to solve this in the most obvious way, or is there a simpler approach that changes the nature of the problem itself? Am I fighting against the current, or can I change the direction the river flows? In the words of Wing Commander Dove himself, speaking to a group of young officers shortly before his retirement, sometimes the most powerful innovations aren't the most complex. They're the ones that change the rules of the game entirely.